Then There's California, the podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policy, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Any check of your own calendar or a scroll back through all of the photos on your phone will give you the stark reminder that it has been a year since the start of the COVID shutdowns and lockdowns that changed our lives. At first, it sort of felt like we were all in this together, you know? My God, if Tom Hanks can get COVID, then for heaven's sakes, the rest of us are all one and the same on this coronavirus journey. But a year later, it has been made clear that we are not suffering or surviving this pandemic equally, and more than 500,000 of our friends and family have died or have lost their jobs, and sometimes their homes, and many more have had their lives broken into pieces, sometimes over and over again. This is most especially the case for many of our students. Our kids have faced a year so far of learning online and in isolation, and that's if they could find an internet hotspot, missing their friends and the chance to just be loud and happy. Some have picked up new hobbies, and some of the older students have even started businesses or are working in service to their communities. But they also miss their band practice and their sports teams. Their grades have slipped. They fought to stay motivated. Their isolation and sense of disconnect mirrors that of their elders, but the kids don't always have access to the tools and listening ears that many of the rest of us have. On this edition of Then There's California, we will focus on some of the mental health challenges facing our communities in the wake of COVID, and in particular, for those of our young people whose psychological and emotional health demand priority focus even in non-pandemic times. And we'll look at the continued efforts that are being made at the public policy level to give students of all ages the bandwidth and support to recognize and address their mental or behavioral health issues. And we'll also chat soberly about those existential crises, I guess you could call them, that don't get put on ice during a pandemic, and in fact can be magnified in their severity and impact. And I'm talking about the devastation of gun violence and the threat and consequences of climate change, both carrying the risk of damage and irrevocable loss to our lives. Anthony Portantino is the state senator from California's 25th Senate District. Senator Portantino grew up in New Jersey, but here he is a couple of generations later, representing and calling home those familiar-sounding Southern California cities of Pasadena and Burbank and Glendale and La Cañada Flint Ridge. And if I'm actually reading the map correctly, he has a good chunk of the Angeles National Forest in his district, above the San Fernando and San Gabriel valleys. Senator Portantino served as a local city council member and a mayor of La Cañada Flint Ridge in the late 90s and early 2000s. He represented his communities in the state assembly from 2006 to 2012. He was elected to the state senate in 2016 and just re-elected last fall to a second term. Senator Portantino is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, one of the two key fiscal committees in the legislature. But more importantly, he is a strong advocate and author of public education, mental health, sensible gun control, affordable housing, and climate change policies that have been personal and legislative gospel for him since becoming an elected official. Senator Portantino has joined us before on this podcast, and we are proud to have him with us again, joining us by phone. Senator Portantino, welcome back to Then There's California.
Well, thank you, Brian. I'm happy to be here, and there's a lot going on in California these days, as is nationally, so it's appropriate to sit down and cover some of those issues.
And I'm glad to have you with us. I know March of 2020 seems at once like a millennium ago, and yet also feels like yesterday. How are you doing and your family? How have you survived and thrived personally and legislatively?
I'm doing fine. Obviously, I have two grown daughters a decade apart, and so I get to see them, one off to college. Unfortunately, lost her senior year of high school due to COVID, like so many young people in that cohort, and lost a big percentage of her college career as well. So we're dealing with that. And then my oldest daughter is, as every parent should feel good, has a job and is working. So that's a good thing. So we're doing as best we can, like everyone else throughout California, under these amazing situations. I mean, we're blessed in a sense that my immediate family has been healthy. We have lost some extended relatives to COVID, like so many other Californians have. But I feel blessed that my immediate family has so far been healthy through this as best we can. And just send my prayers and love to every family that has been devastated by COVID, both economically and through the health challenges as well.
I'm glad to hear everyone on your end is doing well, all things considered. Has it been healthy and healing to be back in Sacramento 4 days a week, more or less, with your colleagues, working in person on what the legislature has to tackle?
I don't know if I would ever call the legislature healthy and healing, but thank you for that. Thank you for that that softball I could hit over the fence.
Has it felt more like normal? Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Well, we are practicing our social distancing. We have, the Capitol is not open to the public. We keep strict protocols following the County of Sacramento guidelines. So, no, it's not logistically functioning anywhere the way it used to. But I will say that, a positive byproduct of COVID is the use of Zoom and electronic communication, I think, has brought more people into the public process. More people have had an opportunity to share their opinions on legislation, to speak during public comment, not requiring everybody to have to get on a plane and fly to the Capitol, has certainly increased public participation from a digital perspective. But the functioning logistics have been adapted to the COVID environment. Though the early actions, I think, have been very important. Extending the eviction moratorium was something that we had to do to stabilize the housing market. And so we've done that. Programming the $6 billion to help our schools reopen, we've accomplished. And obviously the small business relief package, Governor Newsom, 2 days before Christmas, announced the creation of a small business relief package with $500 million for small businesses, could get up to $25,000. And the good news is the program was very, very effective. The bad news is it started out with $500 million. We just put another $2.1 billion into that program. And so anyone who did not get the small business grant in the first round is automatically eligible and carried over into the second round. Nonprofits have to reapply, but the small businesses don't. And so we've been busy on dealing with issues that were critical for the health and welfare of California, mainly schools, housing, and small businesses. So I think that's been very productive.
That's great news.
Right.
Let's talk about your 25th Senate District. I am guessing that people all over California and maybe all over the world already think that we know your district really well. We know about the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, the Norton Simon Museum, the Huntington Library, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with its amazing Mars rovers making us proud right now. There's Disney Studios, the Glendale Galleria. And hey, how many legislators actually get to say they have both movie studios and a forest in their district? So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I am very proud of my district, and I tell my colleagues all the time that I do have the best district in the state of California. And as an honest politician, I say that with a straight face, and my colleagues don't like it when I say that, but the 25th district does rock and stretches from Sunland to Hunga, which is in the city of Los Angeles, all the way to Upland, which is in San Bernardino County along the wonderful foothills at the base of the Angeles Crest Forest in the Angeles Mountains. And as you said, we have some world-renowned institutions. The Rose Bowl, I think, is probably one of the most iconic places in all the world, and everybody knows Walt Disney. But we also, I'm also home to the Claremont Colleges,
right.
Caltech, and the Griffith Park Observatory. Griffith Park itself is in my district, and that's probably the most important urban park in the country. My district's very diverse, which also, I think, makes it a fun and very California place from an ethnic and socioeconomic perspective. For me, it keeps me grounded in the diversity of our state and why it's important to be in tune and converse and open and well represent the diversity of California. And so having such an expansive district allows me the privilege to interact with so many people and get so many perspectives. Today, for example, I was on a 2-hour call with students from San Bernardino County, and they had several presentations on what they see as the challenges facing the state, and they brought solutions to the table as well. And so I love what I get to do, and I love the district that I get to serve.
And in fact, there is really so much more to the 25th than what is on the tourist map. And as you mentioned, your communities, your district population is made up of several diverse ethnicities, most significantly Armenian Americans and Asian Americans. Two communities, and I want to pivot this into a discussion of current times, two communities that have borne tremendous political and cultural burdens, both in history and, sadly, currently. Let's talk about that in light of what has happened here in this country as we speak and in the last several weeks about what's going on in those communities.
Oh, absolutely. I'm proud to represent, I believe, the largest Armenian-American community of any legislator in the country, and it's a vibrant community. And obviously in the past year, the events that took place in Artsakh, which is an ethnic Armenian independent country adjacent to Armenia, has been devastating. I've been to Artsakh 3 times. I was told by a friend of mine in Burbank who was on one of the trips with me that somebody we had lunch with was killed during the war. The Azeri unprovoked attack on Artsakh was devastating. I was actually in a beautiful cathedral in a town called Shushi, which had a sister cities relationship with the city of Los Angeles. And when I was there with City Council member Ardashir Kasakian and Zadeh Sananian, who's now the High Commissioner of the Diaspora in Armenia, we crashed a wedding. And now that the beautiful cathedral that we visited has been destroyed.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's just heart-wrenching. And so, my heart breaks for the Artsakhi people who have maintained peace and sovereignty for so long, for centuries, and now have had a significant portion of their country just invaded and taken over. It's heartbreaking. And obviously you mentioned what's going on with the Asian Pacific Islander community, API community, and the rise in hate crimes. It's just so un-American. It's just so anathema to what we should be as a people, embracing our diversity. I mean, we're a nation that has so many diverse cultures that make us so rich. 88 languages spoken in LA County, I've been told. It's just wrong, and it's not becoming of what we should be as a society in the 21st century. And to think that we have to talk about the rise in hate crimes. And, my district, beyond the large Asian and Armenian communities, there's a long-standing traditional African-American community throughout the district that goes back to the 1930s. That has been vibrant in the San Gabriel Valley. And some of the communities are dealing with some of their racist history and doing very appropriate outreach and undoing some of the old policies that were put in place for racial discrimination back long ago. And in the San Gabriel Valley as well has long been a place where the Latino community, as generations have moved through California, have gone out to the San Gabriel Valley for that piece of the American dream, and one generation has moved to the next generation. And so there's a strong traditional Latino presence throughout the San Gabriel Valley that I'm proud to represent as well. So as I said, the 25th Senate District really is representative of a big portion of who California is and what California is. And, my heart breaks for the groups facing hatred and genocide and un-American feelings.
Indeed, and we keep hearing stories that none of us should be surprised by this.
And it really did emanate from, what happened in Washington, and just the rise of, just for myself. And again, I'm not elevating it to compare what's happened to the hate crimes, but just the level of vitriol that people have on social media and feel that it's okay to be so vitriolic. It's unfortunate. But we have to be positive. We have to stand by one another. We have to love one another. We have to embrace each other in a way that just cuts through this hatred. I tell people how something as simple as a mask could become political when it really is not anything to do with politics. So wearing a mask means you love your neighbor. Wearing a mask means you care about the person sitting next to you. Wearing a mask means you care and you love and you share the space with, your fellow men and women. It's not a political statement. It's a statement of love.
And Senator, as we come out of the darkness of this pandemic, there are still a lot of stories focusing on, encouraging all of us to reflect on and take care of our mental health. And as our society recovers and reunites, a lot of healing will take place. But there's going to have to be a lot of coming to terms with loss and isolation and adjustment. Some of it whiplash and sudden, and other parts of it will linger and impact us and manifest themselves in a lot of ways down the line, and not only pandemic related, but as you have already mentioned here, we've also confronted deep social justice and civil rights scars in our country this past year. But you have focused on this and spoken so eloquently on this in the past and also through your legislation. How serious is this mental health element of our pandemic, and how should we be handling this as a society and individuals?
I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that it is a serious problem. We have to take the stigma off of mental health issues, and we have to recognize that our young people are struggling exponentially. Again, I was just on this panel today and listening to students talk about their lack of positive outlook and looking at college as an optional situation, their sense of losing competition because they're not in a situation where somebody is inspiring them to the way they were before. There, obviously lack of social interaction, the lack of hugs, the lack of high fives, the lack of outdoor exercise, all of those things that contribute to the health and welfare of a human being. Our children have been missing for a year. And, what I find very encouraging is that many of them are outspoken about it. Many of them are coming forward and expressing themselves. But there's so many that don't feel that they can and don't feel like they have anybody to turn to. And so, one of my biggest goals is to make sure that as we return to in-person learning, as we open up and reopen up institutions, and as our young people start to go back to some semblance of a normal life, we have to make sure that we have in place the mental health understanding, the mental health sensitivity, and the mental health planning to deal with that. And so many of the legislative proposals that I'm championing this year deal with creating that infrastructure, making sure that 50% of our school personnel are trained in recognizing mental health warning signs. We took testimony the other day of a father on my bill, SB 14. Father called in and talked about his 14-year-old daughter who turned in her journal for a class assignment and got an A on the journal, but the teacher was not trained to see the warning signs in the journal that she was suicidal. Now, the father was very poignant to say he didn't blame the teacher. The teacher didn't have the training, but had that teacher had the training, that he or she could have seen what that child was crying out for. And shortly after turning in that assignment, that 14-year-old girl committed suicide. And so SB 14 seeks to train 50% of school personnel to recognize warning signs, mental health first aid, some people call it. I mean, we train people in CPR, but we should make sure that whether it's a staff person or an educator or an administrator, that at least 50% of the folks on our campuses are trained to see and recognize and then help steer young people to the place they need to get the appropriate help. There's a companion to it, which is SB 224, which also seeks to create a curriculum for the students themselves, because peer-to-peer relationships are important, and having students know what to do and be trained as well and educated into mental health. So SB 224 requires students to have at least one class on mental health, one age-appropriate class in elementary school, one in middle school, and one in high school. And so I'm trying to take a holistic approach to making our campuses as healthy as possible. And I think that's a goal that everybody shares.
Absolutely. And you for a long time, have made children's and students' mental health a legislative priority. In fact, I remember your bill from a year or 2 years ago that requiring a suicide hotline number to be put on a student ID at the schools. Very foresightful.
Correct. I mean, we don't need to put the football schedule on the student ID, which was the traditional thing that was on it. And so now every seventh grade through college, student ID has the student ID hotline. And again, 99% of the students aren't going to need that number, but the one student that does is going to have it at their fingertips. But the other thing it does is it stimulates the conversation. And I think that's also important here is we talk about destigmatizing mental health, but we have to enact strategies to do that. And one way is to have the conversation out loud. I mean, we'll go to a party and we'll talk about our cholesterol, we'll talk about our weight, we'll talk about whether we have the flu, we'll talk about other things. but we also have to be able to talk about our mental health issues as well. And what I really, really loved about the suicide prevention hotline number on the student IDs is people now will talk about it. It raises the consciousness of why it's there and why it's necessary.
And takes away a stigma, too.
And that's another part of SB 14 is there's a flaw in education code where mental health absences aren't necessarily approved the same way as a cold is approved, as physical health. And what I find fascinating is I've had people come up to me and say, well, what happens if a student is pretending to have anxiety? And I go, well, you don't ask that question when they say they have a cold. You believe them. And the fact that you would think somebody would pretend to have anxiety or bipolar or depression or other forms of mental health issues, the fact that you would even think that they would pretend, but you don't apply the same lens to physical health when somebody says they were absent because they have a cold or the flu, that's why we need the bill. That's why we need to make mental health treated the same way as physical health, because it is real and it is tangible and it is affecting the health and welfare of our kids. And think about being home or being worried about missing a test because you're afraid that your anxiety isn't going to be respected and recognized as a reason to stay home. And then you have to come in and take that test. It just adds to your stress level. And, we have to do everything we can. And I think I've talked to you before. My older brother committed suicide.
That's right. So the mental health struggle, the mental health outreach is very personal for you.
Absolutely. It's a completely personal journey. But the thing that I learned after my brother's suicide was how many people, once I joined the club that no family member should want to join, how many people came up to me and told me about their personal story, their family story, whether it was an aunt, an uncle, a son, a daughter, a mother, a grandmother, dealing with either mental health or suicide. And people that I would see every week at different functions never brought it up, never mentioned it to me until I was a member of the club. And it was such a wide swath of people that it really emphasized to me just how prevalent and across socioeconomic situations and geography and generations, mental health issues are for Californians. And so it really, really makes me passionate about trying to do something about it.
Absolutely. And I know it's been just a bit over 10 years since your brother's suicide. In that 10 years, obviously, I don't mean to be presumptuous or project the thinking here, but I assume that you have used your legislation, mental health in general and mental health for students, as a catalyst for some of that grief and some resolution, if you will, in dealing with your brother's suicide.
Yeah, I mean, I still, like any survivor, you go from one moment being angry to one moment feeling guilty about being angry to one moment trying to channel that into making a difference. I mean, you truthfully, you run through the emotions on all fronts with it. Obviously you miss your family member, in this case, my brother, you miss him, and you get mad at him, and then you think about how it affected the rest of your family, and then you try to figure out how you can use those lessons to help others. And so I do a lot of public speaking about it and learned a lot about the mental health system. He was in and out of 3 different hospitals in 3 different counties, which gave me rise for some legislation that I did in the aftermath to try to bring more of a family element into the hearing process because I felt there were deficiencies that I learned along the way. So you try to channel your frustration and your grief into something productive, and that's something that I try to do.
That means a lot that you would talk about your brother and your family and how you have dealt with this. And talking about the students and thinking about your conversation even today with the students in San Bernardino, there was a story in the New York Times this week featuring some of these heartfelt and conflicted and sorrowful and hopeful college admissions essays that have been written by high school seniors across this country in the last few months in the wake of COVID. Some of them are positive, some of them are hopeful. The college admissions applications were kind of a cathartic thing this year, and I guess it was made a little bit easier because some of the schools have dropped their standardized test qualifications, so more students are applying and more are eligible. But it served as this canvas for these students to pour out their feelings. And
Right.
if you read this article, they're accompanied by photographs and some visuals of the essays. They are striking, and they are stunning and humbling.
And you know what? That's why the peer-to-peer relationships are so important, because young people want to share. A lot of them are afraid to share with their parents. You know, we all have that relationship with our parents where we're not as comfortable as we would like to be. And oftentimes our peers and other outlets, that's where I think social media comes in. It allows, young people to share in a way where they're not looking somebody in the eye and feeling like somebody's going to judge them. And it doesn't surprise me that the essays would reflect that same desire to share inner feelings in an honest way where you're not being judged in a personal, immediate way. And so we have to be sensitive to these issues. I mean, this is a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that has affected our society in so many ways. And that's why I get mad at people who get mad over some of the decision makers, because there was no playbook for this. There was no step 1, step 2, step 3, because it's been an evolving situation with multiple resurgencies and false starts and hopes and dreams, and it's unprecedented.
Senator, one of the gifts you have is you make it easy to talk to you. And it makes me think, when you are in these conversations or soliciting these conversations with these students, is there a trust barrier that you have to breach before they start to dialogue with you? They perhaps look at you and say, who is this 60-year-old politician who tells us he cares? Or are they just so right up at the brim where they just so much want to talk to someone, and then you provide that listening ear and that signal of empathy, and they're ready to talk?
Well, I think the students themselves are smart and articulate and earnest, and they really provide a spark. And I think I legitimately want to hear what they have to say. And I think that's the element. There's an old saying that the second most important part of a conversation is what I have to say.
Right.
I really, really want to hear what they have to offer, and I'm legitimately interested. I always say that the lens that I legislate from or through is as a dad.
Sure.
Now, I will say my own children don't necessarily always respond so well to my questions or my
and I guess that's only natural.
Yeah, that's normal. And so I like to say I get my dad fix when I talk to other people's children, because they're less guarded and more vulnerable and more open with someone else than your own kids. But my daughters will say, "Dad, you ask a lot of questions." And I go, "Yep, I do that to everybody."
How are your girls doing, by the way? I mean, you mentioned them at the front that they're got a job and they're doing college. How are they doing overall?
They're doing well. I will say that my youngest daughter, sometimes I will go back with some of the things that I hear from other young people, and I'll ask her opinion, and she will share her thought process. I have found that to be very helpful to me, because I'll go back and say, "Hey, I did this town hall with these students, or these were the themes. What do you think?" And she'll offer her opinion. So it's been an extra little benefit. But they're doing well. My oldest daughter went to University of Santa Barbara, UCSB, and she is working in the entertainment industry and doing well. And then obviously I have the 19-year-old who is part of that generation that missed out on all of the senior rites of passage. But I'm proud of her. I mean, she's doing well, and it's not easy having a parent who's a politician, number one.
Sure.
Dealing with that for your whole life when you really have no anonymity. So she's had to deal with that, and now dealing with COVID like everybody else. So,
well, someday I'm sure when they think you're out of earshot, they will share with others how proud they are of you.
I hope you're right.
Well, speaking of students, you have made a lot of headlines over the past few years with your provocative bill from a while back that required public middle and high schools in California to adjust their daily school start times. And that bill was signed in 2019 by the governor, finally. And I guess our experiences in 2020 with students not getting up and walking out the door to go to school, didn't really give you the opportunity to see how successful this transition would be and to say to all the skeptics, see, I told you so. But are you pretty confident that students will eventually come to benefit from these later start times?
Oh, absolutely. There's 35 years of research, peer-reviewed actual science that says teenagers require more sleep, and the morning sleep has the most therapeutic value. And schools around the country, in every demographic that have moved their start time back, have seen test scores go up, graduation rates go up, and attendance go up, and depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, self-medication go down. And so I'm really hoping that school districts use this pandemic time when we go back to some semblance of normal, that they put in place the late start. They have 3 years to do it. And the sooner they do it, the healthier our children are going to be. Again, test scores go up and suicidal thoughts go down. I was always amazed that there was pushback. People would get up and say, well, I don't dispute the science, but. And I go, well, if you don't dispute the science, then there can't be a but. But people threw every argument under the sun when we had 35 years of peer-reviewed science and data to show the health and welfare of our kids benefit from sleeping in the morning. Even 15 minutes of extra sleep in the morning showed a measurable benefit to the health and welfare of the students. The teenage brain chemistry, as any parent of a teenager knows, is unique.
Yes.
And it requires more sleep. Teenagers like to sleep and eat. My favorite question was people would go, well, what happens if my daughter's doing homework at 10 o'clock? I'd say that's great because that's when her biological clock says she should be doing her homework. That's a good thing. And she should be sleeping in the morning. Schools used to open later, and then as society got more complex, somebody had the bright idea of shifting everything earlier, and that was contrary to the biological clock and the health and welfare of our kids. And so I just wanted to follow the science and say, let's start a little later and watch our kids thrive, and I anticipate they will, and I'm very, very grateful to Governor Newsom for signing the bill because he looked at the research, he did his homework, I met with him, and he said, give me all the research. I want to independently evaluate this. And he did, and he came to that conclusion. And our kids are going to be better off. They're going to do better in school, and frankly, they're going to have less mental health issues if their schools start later.
Let's talk about these existential challenges that we face in our state and country that I alluded to at the outset. Their origins are not pandemic, but as the headlines have bitterly proved of late, they are impacting our lives right alongside COVID. There was a story this week that said California is seeing a sharp spike in gun ownership. 1.7 million new guns were registered in California last year, and 369,000 people went through our state's background check process for the first time. So we have some of the strictest gun laws in the nation, many of which you have authored, but it is not stopping people from arming themselves to the teeth. Why?
Well, I think, there's unrest. The prior leadership of our country inflamed division, inflamed fear. Bill Clinton once said that, every 4 years we talk about us against them, but the solution is there is no them, there's only us. But what we had for the last 4 years was somebody that exacerbated an us against them and just created this element of fear, whether it was racism against immigrant communities or hatred and anti-Semitism or stoking fear in people that they were losing their country because of them. It's created exacerbated a systemic divide. I was just watching an interview today where George Bush stepped out and had harsh words on the January 6th insurrection.
Yes, I saw that. It said it made him sick.
Yeah, the commentators were saying that, there is the divide in that element of the political establishment, and I'm grateful to George Bush for speaking out. But then you see other leaders, I guess, Kevin McCarthy is trying to distance himself and rewrite history. And you've got the other folks, Ted Cruz and others, looking for political gamesmanship. Rand Paul on wearing a mask. It breaks my heart to think that if people wear a mask, we could cut down on the spread of COVID 85%. If you wear 2 masks, it goes up to 90%. And you have people saying, I'm not going to wear a mask. It's crazy. The fact that The prior president got vaccinated in secret and didn't let people know. Leaders have to lead, and this deep division has to stop. And I just think we have to try to be as neighborly and as humane and pray for each other as much as possible. And I will say, one of the things that I'm so excited and optimistic about is the deportment of President Biden. You know, he has been everything as advertised. He has been Uncle Joe to the country. He has been that calm voice. He has been that person who is being straight with the public and trying to create an aura of unity. I don't think the politicians are necessarily responding to it, but I think the people are. Average people out there want to be treated with respect. They want to be treated with honesty and integrity. They want information, and they want the vitriol to stop. And I think he's doing that. And very, very proud of, obviously, Vice President Harris from California as well, who's part of this change of direction. Again, I don't even think those are partisan statements.
And they are starting to address the issues, or at least feigning interest in the issues that are so important to us, including gun violence and even climate change. Your Senate colleagues who've joined me on these past episodes, especially in the past year, have had a lot to say about the challenge of climate change, the devastating fires, the wildland-urban interfaces, coastal erosion, air pollution, drought. It is devastatingly costly, economically, socially, culturally, not to mention environmentally, to our state and our nation. And again, as the man who has a forest in his district, you are not a stranger to the advocacy on this issue. You have authored legislation this year that would create investment in our state's climate resiliency. So you have SB 45. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, I want to give props to Senator Ben Allen and Senator Henry Stern and others who have been promoting this. Last year, Senator Allen was the lead author. I was a joint author, and this year I'm the lead author, and they're joint authors with a number of other senators. So there's been lots of leadership on this issue. But you're right. I mean, the SB 45 would create about $6 billion of climate resiliency and forest mitigation and water cleanup and other things. It deals with some of the coastal issues as well. Frankly, it pulls off the charts. I mean, the public wants us as a state to become more fire resilient, and they want us to combat climate change. And again, that's not a partisan, that's a bipartisan support across the board. And so we have to get this on the ballot, and we have to get it before the public, and I'm hopeful that we will, because there's no longer a fire season in California. It's pretty much all year long. And it's not just a NorCal or SoCal or Central. It's a statewide issue, and it's a national issue. And, you know, we're the fifth largest economy in the world, and we need to invest in our infrastructure and our resiliency and our mitigation, and that's what SB 45 seeks to do.
California has this reputation for thinking and, some would say cynically, talking foresightfully on this issue. California League of Conservation Voters just this week, for the second year in a row, gave California a C-plus grade on climate action. And, of course, notwithstanding the distractions of the pandemic, yet again last year, the legislature, in their words, abandoned any efforts to deal with the climate crisis. Is that C-plus grade justified? And perhaps your bond proposal can raise that grade, an A for effort and results. What do you think?
Yeah, my philosophy on the external activism is it's important to the process. The role of the activist is to make us do better. And I think the League of Conservation Voters and others and millennials, young people, I mean, climate issues are extremely important to young people, which is exciting. And I think that collective activism is going to make something happen this year. There were efforts last year. The Senate actually had two proposals, and the governor was on board with the Senate proposals. But, you know, the inner house drama at the end of the session cut some of those efforts short. And so, you know, I'm hoping this year that we can have more of a broad focus on it. But, the governor was right there with us to get these proposals through. But there were a couple other hiccups in sort of the end of session drama and the constitutional deadline. The clock ran out on some of them. So it wasn't for lack of effort. Some of it was due to the logistics. But, you know, we have to do more. This is the time to do it. and certainly the public supports us doing more on it. And I'm pleased to be in a position with SB 45 to be hopefully putting it on the governor's desk. Before the pandemic, we had a town hall in my district where we had, over 300 people came to hear about SB 45 and
wow, in person,
lend their support in person. It was at Descanso Gardens, and it was a very, very well attended forum. And we had some climate experts there to testify, and very well received. So, I'm optimistic. I think you pointed out we probably should go back on the federal level. It looks like gun control is going to be one of the next major proposals coming out of the Biden-Harris administration. And, in reaction to some of the things you said, I mean, these mass shootings are largely an American problem. We need to deal with them as a society. I don't have a problem with people protecting their homes, but in the effort to protect your home, you shouldn't be out making the world unsafe for others. And as you know, I 2 years ago had a bill on safe gun storage to bring consequences. If you let your gun fall into the wrong hands and something happens, you're going to be held liable. And you have to be responsible. And it always strikes me as odd that people fight responsibility. If you're going to have a weapon, you need to be responsible for what happens with that weapon. And we should only let those weapons fall into hands who are going to be responsible.
Just some final thoughts, Senator, as we wrap. As we talk about the role of government and the effort of government on the state and federal level, there is this school of thought growing as we reflect particularly on this past year, and even after the past 4 years, that one of the lessons we have learned through the pandemic is that the coronavirus has killed the theory of small government, that an economic and social and health crisis that we weathered in the last year demands a confluence of coordination and expertise and judgment that governments alone can provide. And if government gets in the way, in a toxic way, or even by contrast stays out of the way, then everything falls apart. But when it has a chance to work correctly, federal, state, local government can solve problems. It can allocate money. It can support science and provide the bedrock to some of the challenges we face. Are we finally putting a nail in the coffin of our desire to strangle and amputate government and its role in our society and making it better?
The story I always use to emphasize that is, in my town over the past 20 years, we've changed from septic systems to sewer systems. And I used to say that the quickest way to make somebody go from wanting a public works, public sewer is the day their septic system failed. Then they became pro-sewer. And I go back to what I said in the beginning about being a good neighbor. Being a good neighbor means we take care of each other. Being a good neighbor means we watch out for each other. And there is a role for the government to play in helping us and shepherding us through our needs. And what we have to remember is when we don't have an acute need, we shouldn't then become anti-government when it's not affecting us at that moment. Because when it does, when we call help, we want somebody to be there to answer that call to help. And I think that's the lesson of today, is that California, America, largely because the Trump administration only wanted to help themselves, we have to get back to where we're helping each other because we care about each other. And again, that's not partisan. We should help everybody, and we should certainly be cognizant of those who need more help and the less fortunate, and those who need more of our comfort, because when you have two kids and one is cold, you put the blanket around the one that's cold. It doesn't mean you don't love the one that's not cold, but that one just isn't cold. So you cover the one that's cold, and if the other one gets cold, then you take the blanket from that one and you put it on the other one. So we have to get back to that humane treatment. And I always say you can see a lot of the worst of people when you travel. Hang around the luggage rack and watch people run people over to get their suitcase off a conveyor belt.
Very true.
That spins. And I always say to people, just wait. It'll come around again. You don't have to run somebody over to get your suitcase. And so what we have to do is sort of take a breath, be patient, and let the conveyor belt come around, because then we can get our suitcase. And if there's somebody who can't get their suitcase off the conveyor belt, help them get their suitcase off the conveyor belt. And put it on the little wheelie thing for them so they can get to their car. And just, stop and do those human touches that used to be common courtesy in our lives. And certainly government has a role to play in instilling those values and inspiring people to believe that tomorrow is going to be better. And, hopefully this podcast lets people get a little spirit of that.
I hope so, too. Senator, thank you for these amazing metaphors that bring it all into clarity for us. We have furrowed through a lot of ground here in this conversation. I thank you so much for the dialogue and for your eloquence and for being such a great neighbor, as you say. And I'd love to have you back to chat on whatever issues you think warrant it here on this podcast. So, Senator Portantino, thanks again for joining us on Then There's California.
My pleasure, and everybody be safe.
Thank you, sir. That closes this edition of Then There's California, with technical and production assistance and great ideas from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Gunchan Patel, Ricardo Sainz-Ion, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Anthony Portantino of the 25th Senate District in Southern California, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.